Good morning. I can't believe it's day 3 of our first ever FOP virtual family gathering. We've been thrilled to see everyone's participation in not just the learning activities, but also the fun things that we've been offering and the small discussion groups on Zoom. It's just been an incredible experience to see people coming together from all over the world in different languages, but connecting over one common thread, and that is to do the most we can in a variety of ways to care for and to develop treatments for people that are living with FOP and their families. I want to start this morning off by again just saying from the bottom of our hearts how grateful we are to our sponsors, to our visionary sponsors, Ipsen and Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, to our leadership sponsor who is new this year, Insight, and then to our gathering supporters, to Ava Therapeutics and also to BioCryst. I hope that you had a chance to stop by the exhibit hall and visit with them, visit their booths, I should say. And there will be time this afternoon, later this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, to visit them one more time in the exhibit hall. So please do take that opportunity. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. You will see a chat button. It's a great place for you to, if you want to just share a comment, that's a great place to do that. But where we would love for you to really interact with us is on the question and answers panel. This is going to be a great session about patient and family involvement in clinical trials. So if you have questions, we hope that you'll drop those in the questions and answers panel. And then you'll also see the link for Wordly. If you would like to have this session translated, we have up to 17 languages available to you. You just click on that button, select your language, and then the translation automatically starts. You can also, there are going to be slides for this presentation, but if you would like to resize your screens at all, you can make your video panel larger. So take advantage of all of the great opportunities that this virtual platform provides. So I'm excited that we're going to kick off the sessions today with this session on clinical trials. You heard on day 1 about some of the trials that are in various phases, from phases 1 to 3 for families that are living with FOP. And today is a chance for you to hear a little bit more about clinical trial process and what your role is, what your rights are, and what your responsibilities are in clinical trials. And I'm really pleased to have Kendall Davis today with us. She is with PRA Health Sciences. But Kendall brings an incredible background. She's worked in pharma. She's also worked for global for advocacy organizations like Global Genes. Many of you are very familiar with Global Genes. And now she's with PRA Health Sciences, where she works in patient advocacy. So she's going to be a fabulous resource for you today, and I hope that you'll take advantage of the opportunity to learn from her and to also pose questions and answers. We will address those at the end of the session after she's finished with her slides. So with that, I will turn it over to Kendall.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. I am so excited to be here and chatting with all of you today. Like Michelle said, I used to work for Global Genes, and so I was introduced to the IFOPA years ago and have always just admired this organization so much. So much, in fact, that I actually, when I came to PRA, and I'll tell you a bit about what I do now, one of the first things I wanted to do was to create some corporate guidelines for us so that we, as a company, could really make sure that when we're talking about patient advocacy and clinical drug development, that we're really bringing the patient into the center and doing things right. And I used the IFOPA's guidelines for interacting with patient organizations and pharma companies as a resource for those. So I was really excited when Hope reached out to me to talk with all of you today. And I could talk about clinical drug development and rare disease all day. So it's probably good we only have an hour, or you'd get a little sick of hearing from me. But so just thank you all for your time this morning and just for everything you're doing as patients and families and caregivers in the FOP community. Rare disease patients and their families are just just responsible for a lot more. And it's not always fair, but it's necessary. And everything you're doing and the strength that you have and the community that you're building is just, it's so powerful and incredible. And I'm very just honored to be a part of it today. I hope that this session is useful and that you are able to, get some clarification around things that have to do with clinical research that might be seemingly complicated. You are welcome to reach out to me at any point in time. I believe my contact information is at the end of the presentation, but if there's ever anything that I can do for any of you or questions you have, I'm always happy to be a resource to the rare community. So again, my name is Kendall Davis and I work for PRA Health Sciences. So PRA is a CRO, which is a clinical research organization. I'll talk a bit about that in just a moment. But my role is I work in patient advocacy strategy at PRA. So we have a rare disease specific team, and I work even more specifically on patient advocacy within the rare disease space. So when a company wants to build a clinical trial, if they come to PRA and it's in rare disease, I will work directly with that company to make sure that the way we're building a clinical trial really makes sense for a community. It's taking into account the needs and what's really going to be meaningful to a patient population. Because at the end of the day, we don't have time to do clinical trials wrong, right? In rare disease, we don't have time. We're waiting for therapies. It's so important. All of these individuals, deserve to have options, and the best way that we can do all of this and make things happen as quickly as possible is to design and develop clinical trials with patients. So when we really understand exactly what you need and what's going to be meaningful to you and what's going to make a trial accessible, then we can actually build a study to mirror the needs and the wants of the community and what's going to make sense. And that will just help us to be able to execute the trial in a much more efficient way and bring meaningful therapies to patients faster. So essentially, I work to make sure that happens. So I work directly with patient organizations and patients themselves to hold focus groups, advisory boards, do protocol reviews to make sure that we're getting as much insight as humanly possible into what we're doing and what's going to be effective and meaningful for your community. So I'm pretty excited to talk to you about rare disease clinical trials today. Clinical trials are incredibly complicated and there's just so much information out there. And so I'm hoping today to provide a little bit more of an overview of what a clinical trial is, what some of the terminology you might hear are, what it means to participate for the actual participant, but as well as the family, and kind of hopefully dive into some of the ways that, rare disease clinical research and clinical trials are just very, very different, and how we as a patient community can really help all of these trials come to fruition faster. So just to kind of level set, you'll hear the term clinical research a lot and clinical trials, and they are a bit different. So clinical research is a type of medical research that really looks at, developing a therapy and using humans to test an idea to see if a drug works. Clinical trials are just a piece of clinical research. So they're the part of clinical research that really looks to collect the data. So the clinical trial is just a tiny piece of this really big puzzle, but it's probably one of the most important pieces because it's going to be the time when we actually are able to see if a drug or a therapy is safe and if it's effective and if it's going to be something that can benefit the larger community. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a research study, that is conducted in humans, and we're looking to answer a specific question. So we are essentially testing a drug to see if it's safe and at what dose it is optimal, and if it's going to be effective to treat a specific question that we're looking at. They're used to determine, again, the safety and efficacy of a drug, and clinical trials are broken down into phases. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But it's important to know that every phase of a clinical trial is really, really important. And as a drug progresses through the phases, it gets closer and closer to being available to the larger population. A lot of clinical trials don't make it through all phases. It's pretty incredible the number of targets or therapies that start out and maybe don't make it even through phase 1, or they might make it to phase 2 and not into phase 3. But I want to assure you that even if a clinical trial doesn't advance or doesn't meet an endpoint, it doesn't mean that that trial wasn't incredibly important. And it doesn't mean that your participation in that trial wasn't a huge step forward for advancement in research in this space. Clinical trials are complicated, and a lot of times we do see failures. But just because a drug technically fails doesn't mean that that information, all the research and all the data and all of the learnings aren't incredibly powerful, and they're most likely going to help subsequent drugs or phases of clinical trials be more effective and efficient. So when we're talking about clinical trials, it's really important to think about how rare disease clinical research and clinical trials are different. So, like I said before, in rare disease, patients and their families and their communities are just responsible for a lot more. And it doesn't seem fair all the time, and it makes your participation that much more important. But rare disease clinical trials are just a lot more difficult to conduct than, a clinical trial in a more common condition. You're never going to find thousands of patients in a rare disease space that all live in one area and can participate in a clinical trial at the same time. It just doesn't happen. And so it's really important when we are designing clinical research in rare disease that we are working with patients and patient organizations, because it's just a lot harder. There's a lot less known about the diseases. And luckily, the FOP community has a couple of great clinical trials in development right now. And there's a lot more known today than 10 years ago in this space. And so every day, and with every clinical trial, and with every every research study, more and more is being learned, but we still don't know as much as we do about more common conditions. And that lack of information just makes developing clinical trials in rare disease harder. So if you have the opportunity to participate in a patient registry, I know the IFOPA has one, or a natural history study, I can't tell you how important that is and how valuable that information is, because that is the type of information that we need in order to do clinical research better. So it may, if you have a chance, or you see a survey, or, the IFOPA sends you an email saying, hey, there's a company that is interested in our space, but they need some individuals for a focus group. That might not seem, important, or you may not understand why that's so necessary, but I assure you that information is so valuable, and it's everything for the researchers and for the companies and for people like me who are wanting to make sure that we're building clinical trials in the best way possible. So, your involvement in registries and natural history studies, and hopefully in clinical trials, it's so wonderful, and it's such a gift to the community, and it's so important. So never feel like anything that you're doing, any questionnaire you're filling out, is for nothing. I guarantee you that it is helping a lot of people move forward in getting therapy to your community a lot faster. There are fewer patients, right? So rare diseases are rare, and they don't impact as many people. And so with fewer patients come a lot of considerations. So you're looking at smaller populations of people to pick from, or to be able to include in your clinical trial. And most likely these patients don't all live in the same area. So even finding an area where a site makes sense so that travel isn't a huge issue, can be really difficult. So just the fewer number of patients that exist in rare disease and the physical location of where these people live can make building a rare disease clinical trial really difficult. Participation in a clinical trial can be kind of burdensome. You have to really take into account what is being asked of you in a clinical trial, how it's going to impact not only the individual participating, but the family or the caregivers or anybody, in your support system that might, have something to do with the trial participation. And so you have to really think about what a clinical trial is asking of you and if it's going to make sense, for you to enroll and to participate, because there are a lot of asks and there is a lot involved in clinical trials. And so the burden can be problematic. Again, this is something that hopefully companies are reaching out and working directly with you and the IFOPA to reduce the burden or to create mitigation strategies around these burdens. But it is something to consider. And because rare disease clinical trials are more burdensome, sometimes it can make it more difficult for patients to participate. So all of these things just kind of add to the complexity and make building clinical trials in rare disease harder. But I assure you, there are a lot of people out there working tirelessly to correct this and to make sure that we are building trials that make sense. There's a lot of people involved in building a clinical trial, and everyone really is centered around how do we do this efficiently? How do we make it as less burdensome as possible for everybody involved? And how do we get this therapy to market faster? Another consideration in rare disease is that a lot of rare diseases impact children, right? And a lot of companies are not interested in testing out drugs in children first. And so a lot of times age can be a pretty big restriction in clinical trials because we want to make sure that a drug that we're testing is safe in adults before we test it in children. This isn't always the case, but it is something that we do see frequently. And this can be, harder for indications that do impact a lot of kids, because we just have to consider the risk factor if we're going to build a clinical trial in a rare disease that impacts children. And usually we see companies wanting to test it in adults first. So these are just some, areas that make building clinical trials in rare disease a lot harder. It's not impossible. We do it every day and we're getting a lot more better at it as an industry, but it really is because of, patients like all of you and organizations like the IFOPA and your willingness to answer our questions and to talk with us and make sure that we know what's meaningful to you. So again, just thank you all for anything you're doing to, participate in registries or natural history studies or considering trials, because therapies just aren't gonna be available without it. So whenever you have a clinical trial, you always have a clinical trial sponsor. And essentially, this is just whoever's paying for the clinical trial. So sponsors can be drug companies. And I know there's a couple of really fantastic ones that are working in the FOP space. Sponsors can be foundations. Sometimes patient organizations actually fund clinical trials. We see this a lot more in larger indications, but it does happen in rare disease. Medical institutions and universities can be sponsors, as well as federal agencies. The NIH, sponsors clinical trials all of the time. So really a sponsor can be one or a group of entities, but it really just means who's paying for the trial. So when I say I work with sponsors, a lot of times that is drug companies. So I'll work directly with pharmaceutical companies that are developing clinical trials in rare disease to make sure that we are optimizing patient participation. So just want to touch really quickly on what a CRO is. So PRA, my company, is a CRO. So we're a contract research organization. And you may never have heard of a CRO, or you may never have interacted with one, and that's okay. This is definitely kind of a new role. I don't know of a lot of other CROs that have someone dedicated to patient advocacy, so I think it's a little unique for my company. But really what the CRO does is we work with the sponsors to essentially execute the clinical trial. So we kind of play air traffic control with all of the different elements and moving parts and different entities that exist when you're trying to get a clinical trial off the ground. And so we kind of manage and coordinate and execute all of those activities. So there's a chance that you might be contacted by somebody from a CRO. If you are participating in a trial. I've worked with companies in a capacity where my email's been provided so that if an individual is interested in a clinical trial in a certain space, they can reach out to me and I'll actually connect them directly with the study coordinator just to make it a little easier to, connect patients directly to sites. So there might be an opportunity or a situation where you might get contacted by somebody from a CRO, but we really are just an extension of the company or the entity who's sponsoring the clinical trial. All right, so there's a lot of terminology in clinical research and in clinical trials, and a lot of it is kind of complex and confusing. And so I wanted to go through just a couple of terms that I think that you're going to hear more often. This is not by any means an exhaustive list of terminology that you're going to hear in clinical trials, but I think some of the terms that I want to outline here are things that you'll hear more often than not. So inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this can be kind of frustrating for patients because every clinical trial and every phase is going to have different inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so what this is they're the requirements that have to be met for a patient to participate in a study. And so each clinical trial is going to be different. Each phase might have different inclusion, exclusion criteria. And it's really important to know that just because you don't meet this criteria, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong or that you should be upset because you don't meet the criteria. This criteria is designed to answer a very specific question. So it has to be really narrow, and we are, looking all the time at ways that we can expand inclusion, exclusion criteria. But it is a pretty, specific set of requirements that exist to evaluate a person's participation in a study. Healthy volunteers versus patient volunteers. So a healthy volunteer is somebody that may not have a disease, and they're just looking to participate in a earlier phase or a phase 1 study to see if a drug is potentially going to be safe to take. So a healthy volunteer, like I said, won't necessarily have a rare disease or any type of disease at all, and they're used only in the earlier phases of clinical development. A patient volunteer is somebody who has the disease that we're looking at and is volunteering to participate in a clinical trial. So we get into patients trials in phases 2 and 3, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So like I said, so you'll see healthy volunteers participate earlier just to test the safety of a drug. And then as soon as the safety has been confirmed, we move into patient volunteer trials where we are actually testing a drug in the patient population. It's always a great way if, people who don't really understand clinical research, or if you want to, help friends or family know kind of what you might be going through, see if they want to volunteer in a healthy volunteer study. It's a really cool way to kind of understand a little bit more about what individuals going through clinical research are going through. Informed consent. So informed consent is, it's probably one of the most important pieces of any clinical trial or research study. So it is the agreement that will explain everything about the trial to you. So you'll learn all about the study therapy. You'll be told what the schedule of assessments looks like, which is going to be, how often you might have to go to a clinic. The informed consent should provide you all of the information that you need about the trial to determine whether or not you think participation makes sense for you. You'll learn about the risks and the benefits to participation, as well as your rights and your ability to leave the trial at any point in time. It's so important for people to understand that if you enroll in a clinical trial and at any point you decide that it no longer makes sense for you, you do have the right to leave. No questions asked at any point. An institutional review board or an ethics committee. This is an independent group that will evaluate everything that has to do with the study. So the protocol, which is basically the recipe or the steps that are going to happen within a clinical trial. Any information that's patient facing, so any information that you might receive from a company about a clinical trial, any type of recruitment strategy, all of that has to be approved by an institutional review board. Like indicated here, it might sometimes be called an ethics review board or an ethics committee. But I wanted to highlight this because I think it's important for patients to know that every single aspect of a clinical trial is reviewed by an independent board. This is meant to, prioritize the safety of patients and make sure that every single thing that we're doing, every piece of information that you're going to see is accurate, it makes sense for the trial, and is prioritizing, again, the safety of the participants. A placebo is a part of a treatment that looks exactly like the study drug but has no active ingredient. So a lot of clinical trials do use a placebo. I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. And it's essentially used to be able to do a side-by-side comparison between someone who is getting the active drug, so the drug that we're looking at, and a placebo. And it's probably the most effective way to compare to see if a drug is working. The principal investigator, or PI, is going to be the person who is in charge of overseeing a clinical trial at the clinical trial site. So a lot of your physicians might actually be PIs. So in rare disease, we do see physicians that are, key opinion leaders in the space, or, since there aren't that many doctors globally that really know and are experts in certain rare diseases, a lot of times those physicians are also PIs. So they're the primary investigator of a clinical trial, and they're kind of the one who's running everything to make sure that, again, we're prioritizing safety of the study and all of the participants. The site coordinator is just such a wonderful, incredible person, usually a nurse or a physician's assistant, but someone who works directly with the principal investigator throughout the clinical trial to make sure that the trial is upholding the good clinical practice guidelines and is running as effectively as possible. So a lot of the time when you are interested in participating in a clinical trial and you want to get connected to a site, you'll probably talk to the site coordinator, and they are going to be the individual that can answer all of your questions. They'll probably go through the informed consent with you, and they're just a wealth of information, and they work so hard and are trained on so many different aspects of the trial to make sure that they can be a full support to you. So again, if you do have the opportunity to get involved in clinical research, make sure you're talking to the site coordinator, ask as many questions as you have, and feel free to contact them, whenever you need to. They really are there to be as much of a support throughout the whole process for you and your family as you need. Randomization is another term we hear a lot, and it's just a type of it's a way to put people into different groups within a clinical trial to, again, kind of assess which group might get a placebo or the active drug. It's just a way to compare to see if a therapy is working, and it's one of the most highly regarded ways that we do clinical research. You might hear single-blinded versus double-blinded studies. A single-blinded study means that participants in a clinical trial don't know if they've been randomized into the placebo group or the active treatment group. But the primary investigator would know. So you'd have the participant wouldn't know if they were getting the placebo or the active drug, but the primary investigator would know what the participant was getting. In a double-blinded study, the participant doesn't know and the PI doesn't know. So you have a group of people that are getting the study drug and a group of people that are getting placebo, but nobody knows who's getting what. And it's a really effective way to reduce bias within a clinical study and to make sure that things are being done really effectively. Couple more. So a clinical endpoint is essentially what we're looking to get data on. So the endpoint is going to be kind of this really important piece of information that the study is designed to either prove or disprove. So the endpoint is, what we're looking for. So all clinical trials, if they meet their clinical endpoints, then they move to the next phase. A surrogate endpoint is often a biomarker or something used instead of a clinical endpoint, and it might be to determine like a genetic characteristic or something else that they want to measure. So the clinical endpoint is always what's going to move a therapy through the phases of development, and it's what the success of a clinical trial is going to be assessed on. But there are other surrogate endpoints that a lot of times are used to show the effect of a drug on different aspects of a disease. So I want to talk a little bit about placebo-controlled studies. Placebo can be kind of a confusing and a really frustrating aspect of clinical trials for a lot of patients, especially in rare disease, because there aren't a lot of therapies or drugs to choose from. And so it can be really stressful when you're thinking about participating in a clinical trial if you know that there's an option that you're going to get the placebo. I will say that, having a placebo-controlled trial is probably the fastest way to determine if a treatment works. And it can reduce the amount of time that a clinical trial takes, because you are able to much more quickly compare if a drug is working or not. So you'll have two groups of people that all fit the same inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you can compare, side by side, the group that is taking the placebo as well as the group that's taking the treatment. So placebo-controlled trials can be, they're controversial, and again, they can be really frustrating, but they are the fastest way to get to an answer as to whether or not something's working and if it's going to be safe and effective. So I know that it's a big consideration when you're thinking about participating in clinical research if there is a placebo control, but it's really important. And again, it is the fastest way to get a drug to market. So when we talk about clinical trials and the different phases, I just kind of wanted to highlight really quickly what those look like. I know that there's just so much information, and the IFOPA has really incredible resources to kind of walk you through what these phases look like. But so just really quickly here, your phase 1 study is going to be the study that's done with healthy volunteers, just to test the safety of a drug. So this graphic is from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, and I think it highlights it really well. Phase 1 trials they're usually pretty short. You don't need a ton of people, and you're really just looking to see, okay, is this drug safe, and how does it work in the body? So how is the body processing this therapy? And are there any, side effects that would need to be considered before moving into the next phase? If a drug seems safe and if the side effects are minimal and it looks like it's going to be effective, I'm sorry, if it looks like it's going to make sense, it'll move into phase 2. Phase 2 trials are going to be the first trial that brings in individuals with the indication or with the rare disease that we're looking at. You'll need a few more people. They're still pretty small, especially in rare disease, but you do need to be able to test this in a wider population. It takes a bit more time to participate in a phase 2 trial, usually anywhere between 3 and 12 months. We're again looking at whether or not this compound is safe in the community that we're interested in, but we're also looking at the dosage. So in phase 2 trials, you'll look to see what the optimal dose is and how often it can be taken, how well is it working, all while still considering if it's safe. And throughout all of these phases, again, I just wanted to kind of reiterate, there are data review boards and the ethics committee that are looking at this information constantly to make sure that safety of the participants is the priority. And at any point in time, if any of these review boards think that there's an issue, a trial can be paused, again, to make sure that above anything, the priority is the safety of patients. If a drug makes it through a phase 2 trial, it'll move into phase 3. Phase 3 trials can often be called pivotal trials because we're really looking to see at this point if it works. So we're really evaluating whether or not a therapy is going to be effective excuse me, in the rare disease that we're looking at. Phase 3 trials are, a little lengthy as well, usually between 6 and 12 months, sometimes longer, not usually shorter. They do need more people. So this is, again, going to be a really important time for people to participate in clinical trials, because this is the trial where we're really going to be finding out whether or not in a larger population a drug works. If it meets its endpoints and it's successful in phase 3, it'll go to the FDA for review and approval. And if the FDA determines based on all of the information that it is safe and it's effective, then it will be approved and available to the general public. There is also another phase that happens after this, and it really is to just continue to test the safety of a drug and the efficacy in comparison to the current standard of care. So you might hear a phase 4 trial. Usually we really only talk about phases 1, 2, and 3, but phase 4 trials are really important as well because it provides more long-term data about a therapy and how it's interacting with the community. So when we talk about clinical trial sites, again, this is just where the clinical trial is taking place. And I just wanted to kind of talk through a couple points about how sites are selected because, again, we talked about in rare disease clinical research, it's so difficult because there are so few patients and they might live all over the world. So how do you pick a site that can have a clinical trial that, makes sense for the population? And so there's a lot that goes into site selection. It's this really intense process. I didn't know anything about it until I joined PRA, and now just seeing kind of what goes into selecting sites. I mean, it's a pretty incredible feat to get a good group of clinical trial sites for a study. And I want you to know that if you're going to a site to participate in a clinical trial, they have gone through so much to be a site, and they're just really incredible and deserve just so much praise for just going through the whole process and, working with the CRO and the sponsor. Patient population availability can be a huge, factor in determining a site. So again, we know that there are few patients in rare diseases. We know that they're really spread out. And so we try to find sites that are relatively localized so that we can reduce the amount of travel that might have to happen. And again, reduce the burdens that we're going to see associated with that. The availability of resources at a site is another important thing to consider. So does the PI, have the staff to conduct a clinical trial? Do they have the equipment that they need to run the tests that are needed in the clinical trial? So all of these things are taken into consideration. So if, for instance, maybe the doctor that you see on a regular basis isn't a site or isn't participating, it might not have anything to do with whether or not, the PI or your doctor is qualified. It just might be more about the site and the availability and the resources that they have to make sure a clinical trial will be successful. A couple other, things to consider about site selection or, the staff qualification. So again, if you don't have researchers, site coordinators, you can't really run a clinical study. The equipment and the facility is really important. So let's say you have a trial where a patient's going to have to stay overnight. Do you have the resources or does your facility allow for that? So all of these things are taken into consideration when we're looking at sites. Population profile and access, again, we talked about that. Maybe past performance. So if sites have previous experience running clinical trials, especially in a certain indication, then we definitely want to work with them because they already kind of know what they might be getting into, and they have some experience with the community. So that's always something that we love to see if a site does have previous experience, and this could make them a lot more of an ideal candidate for running a trial. Also, competition. So some sites will run multiple clinical trials, but usually within rare disease trials, you'll see if there is a competing site competing clinical trial, companies will try to use different sites so that there aren't any issues with the competitive nature of the two trials. All right, so I've thrown a lot at you in regard to terminology and kind of what, clinical trials can look like. And so I wanted to talk a bit about what you can really expect, because engaging in clinical trials, I can tell you all day that it's so important and that it's going to advance research and it's, just this amazing thing that you can do. But there's so much to consider and to think about prior to getting involved. And it's, I think it's important for everyone to understand that participating in clinical research is a very personal decision. It's something that I would really encourage you not to enter into lightly. I think there's a lot of things about clinical trials that need to be considered before you decide that you really want to get involved. And so I wanted to walk through kind of what you can expect in a clinical trial and maybe things to consider before you decide you want to participate. So kind of the first step is consideration. So you read about a clinical trial and you think, hey, maybe this is a good fit for me. I really encourage you to talk to your, family or anybody who might be involved in any aspect. So if the trial, is a couple hours away and you're going to have to drive a couple times to go to the site, who's going to be kind of in charge of that aspect of it? Talk to all the people that are going to be involved in supporting you and your family through a clinical trial, because support's necessary, and clinical trials are a pretty big time commitment. And so really thinking through all of the different ways that participating might impact your daily life and understanding that, yes, this makes sense for you at this point in time, or maybe it doesn't, it's really important to kind of think through all of that. Definitely be talking to your doctor, your medical team. They're going to be able to help you kind of walk through, maybe some of the more medically specific aspects to see if it's going to be a good fit. They'll be able to answer more questions. You can always reach out and talk to the site coordinator to kind of determine or to get a little bit more information about the site, maybe before you decide that you want to consent. So definitely talk through anybody that you think is going to be involved in supporting you in a clinical trial, or you or your family. But just know that it's a very personal decision and not one to kind of enter into lightly. So if you do decide, you find a trial, you think it's going to be a great fit, you will get connected to a site coordinator and you'll go through the informed consent process. So this is the process where we talked about earlier. You're going to learn all about the clinical trial, what you can expect, what the schedule of assessments or visits is going to look like, all the different tests that they're going to be doing throughout the trial. And if you still are if you decide at that point that you still would like to proceed forward, you do, you provide written consent, and then you are able to go through the pre-screening process. So once you've consented into the study, you'll go through the pre-screening and pre-testing process, which will just, it'll most likely be some lab tests to determine and make sure that you do in fact meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And if you get through this phase, then you'll actually get into the treatment part of the clinical trial. So there's kind of a lot that happens before you might even see or take a study drug. But it's all, you know, it's all part of the bigger picture, and it's all very important, but it can be timely. So just, you know, make sure that you're considering what this actually looks like when you're thinking about participating. When you are in the treatment phase, this is when you'll be receiving either the drug or possibly the placebo, depending on the type of study it is. And you'll be going through continual evaluation and assessment during the treatment phase. So most likely you'll be visiting the site a couple of times, unless the study has the ability for a nurse to come to your home. That's also an option in some studies. But you'll basically you'll be taking the medication, and you'll be getting evaluated in different intervals to collect data. After the treatment phase, you'll go into the post-treatment testing. So once the treatment phase is concluded, you'll do some final testing to also be able to provide the site with the ability to collect data on what's happening after the treatment phase, and then you'll exit the study essentially, but there is usually always follow-up. So again, this is something to consider. So where a treatment phase only might be 3 months, the trial that you're participating in might require participation for a year, because you might have a pre-screening phase of a couple of weeks, depending on the type of trial. And then you'll have the treatment phase, which is a certain amount of time, and then the follow-up. And the follow-up is so important. All of these, phases are they're so important. But it is really, again, important to kind of consider what the actual participation time is going to look like, because we need that data from every phase of this and every part of the trial. It's so important to making sure that we can move a drug through this process in the most effective way, so that it has the highest, the best ability to get approved by the FDA. So reasons to consider participating in a clinical trial, there's a lot of them, especially in rare diseases. I think it's fantastic that there has been so much kind of movement in the clinical trial and clinical research space within the FOP community. But we still don't have approved therapies, so there's a lot of reasons to consider participation. If you do participate in a clinical trial, you are being given access to new therapies a lot faster. So, it can take years and years for a clinical trial to conclude and for a drug to come to market. And so by participating in a clinical trial, you do have access to the medication a lot sooner. Clinical trials really need as diverse of a patient population as possible. And this can't be understated enough. It's so important for clinical trials to be able to really represent the community. And so just by participating, you are providing that data that is just so vital to making sure a medication or a therapy makes sense and really is going to work for the larger population. Clinical trials advance knowledge, at the crux of what they do. We're trying to get therapies to patients faster, but we can't do that without clinical trials. It's not possible. Not right now anyway. And so without clinical trials and without participation, it doesn't happen. And so, again, clinical trial participation is very personal and there's a lot to consider, but it really is the only way that we're going to see therapies come to market. And so if you have the ability to participate and you decide with your family and your caregivers and your medical team that it makes sense, it's such an incredible thing to do for the community and for the advancement of science in this space. Clinical trials let you take an active role in your healthcare. So a lot of times in rare diseases, if there's not a therapy to treat your disease and you're taking different therapies to treat symptoms, I mean, you're not really actively able to participate in your healthcare. And by participating in a clinical trial, you are taking more of an active role, and just, again, helping to advance this science that is so important for all of the individuals globally, that are living with this and may be diagnosed with it, later down the road. So a lot of reasons to consider participation, but a lot of considerations. Clinical trial data is the integrity of data is really important. It's something I kind of wanted to touch on. So if you do decide to participate in a clinical trial, you are, what you're doing, that data is, I really can't stress the importance of it, right? But you do have to consider that, there might be information, or a site might request that you not post on social media about the trial, or try to restrict any information that you're sharing, about your participation, because it could potentially impact the integrity of the data, and that the data is really all that a company has. So if something happens to the integrity of the data, it could slow or possibly cause problems down the road with getting a therapy approved by the FDA. So it is really important just to kind of, keep in mind that when you are participating in a clinical trial, that data is, it's kind of secret at that time. And so there has to be a pretty big emphasis placed on protecting it. So where can I find information about clinical trials? So I 100% would start with the IFOPA. This community has just such an awesome organization. And I hope that all rare disease organizations can provide the type of resources that the IFOPA has. It's really incredible, just the way that even the website is laid out and the information that's available there. And I think they're going to be your first stop for finding out what kind of trials are available for your specific community. Your doctor hopefully will have this information too, but if you're kind of just wanting to get more information and you're online, check out the IFOPA. You can always go to clinicaltrials.gov, but it's not really the most, user-friendly website. There's SysScript. They have a really fantastic clinical trial search function, as well as Clara Health, which is listed here. So if you're just kind of interested in getting to know more about trials that are available in your space, always start with the IFOPA, but you can definitely check out some of the other resources listed here. All right, so I think we still have about 10 minutes. Again, this is my email address and my phone number. Please feel free to reach out at any point in time. If I can't answer a question, I will let you know. If you have questions, even after this, please feel free to email either Michelle or Hope, and they can get in contact with me, or you can just reach out directly.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you so much, Kendall. That was super insightful. We have had a couple of questions that have come in that I would love to have you address. The first is about the role of the CRO. So are all pharmaceutical companies required to use a CRO to manage their clinical trial?
No. So, no. The quick answer to that is no. So some companies actually will keep their trial in-house. You'll hear is a term. So they have the ability to essentially do all of the different things that a CRO can do. A lot of times, if companies are doing a very small trial, or they're using maybe one site, or they're looking at something very specific, or maybe it's not as like large scale or global of a trial, some companies could keep it in-house. But I think the majority of the time you will see companies working with a CRO.
Okay. And then there was a follow-up question about CROs. Do they exist in every country, or are they just a US?
Yeah, so they are all over the world. So PRA, for example, we have offices all over. I was just on the phone a couple of days ago with colleagues in Japan. So we have offices in Japan, all over Europe and South America, Africa. there are CROs that exist very specifically in certain countries. So we will even partner with CROs in areas, where maybe it doesn't make sense for us to have an office. And so we'll actually partner with a country-specific CRO to work with patients there. So they do exist globally.
Okay, good. Thank you. The next question is about kind of the after clinical trials and when drugs are approved. So the question is, does a drug have to be approved in each country for patients to be able to have access to it? Or is there like a global approval that allows patients, if it's approved in the US, then patients anywhere can use it?
Man, if there was global approval, I feel like my job would be so much easier. I would love that. I feel like maybe one day, hopefully we're getting to that. But so drugs do have to be approved in every country. And it really depends. And we could have a whole nother hour conversation about drug approval. But I think kind of the basic takeaway should be that drugs do have to be approved. Different healthcare systems and different medicine agencies have to approve drugs in different ways. So just because a drug gets approved in the US does not mean you'll have access to it even in Canada or, the UK or anywhere in Europe. So it does definitely depend on the regulatory agency within the country. And sometimes companies have to actually run a trial in a specific country to have a drug approved there.
Okay.
The FDA and the EMA, which is the European Medicines Agency, they work really closely together. And we're starting to see a lot more collaboration around where trials are run and where drugs are approved. But I would say the takeaway is that they have to get approved in every country.
Right. Okay. And then one of the questions that's come up several times is there anything that a family can do to try and encourage a pharmaceutical company to bring a clinical trial to their country?
Oh, that's a great question. So if there's an organization, so if there's an FOP organization specifically in a country, I think that can be hugely impactful. Organizations, I can't tell you how valuable they are to companies within the clinical trial developing space. I mean, the access they have to patients, just the way they can communicate, all of that information it's a gold mine for companies that want to build a clinical trial. And it's so important that those collaborations and those relationships exist. So I would really encourage if you live in a country and you want to be active and maybe you have an active organization in your country to reach out. There are ways you can get connected to biotech and pharmaceutical companies. I would caveat that I promise that companies are doing the best that they can and to make decisions in the best way to go to countries that are going to make the most sense. When I said site selection is a process, it is a very intense process and there's a lot that goes into it. And country selection is a part of that as well. And hours and hours and hours are spent kind of trying to determine the most appropriate countries, and a lot goes into it. So if there is an organization in your country, I would definitely support them and encourage them to have conversations. If not, reach out. I think the IFOPA has great relationships with the companies in this space. And there might be an opportunity to have more of a conversation with the drug companies about why they might be in certain countries. But I assure you that a lot of that's happening on the back end. It is everybody's objective to get this drug approved in every country where there is an FOP patient.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that's a great question to end on. I will just mention that I left in the chat a specific part of our website that is just dedicated to clinical studies and trials. So it's ifopa.org/about, and then a dash clinical dash trials. And when you go there, you'll find a glossary of terms. You'll learn more about the clinical trial phases. There are several videos about drug development and clinical trials that you can watch. Those are available on YouTube, so they can be translated. You'll also see a list of ongoing clinical trials in FOP, and it's a chart and where they are in the various phases. Right now, they're in phases 1 to 3 FOP clinical trials. And you can click on the name of the trial and learn more. You'll see inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, what the status is, if they're recruiting or if they're active and not recruiting. And then the other thing that I would encourage you to look at is the section on participating in other research. So there are clinical trials which are interventional, where you're taking a drug to try and stop FOP's progression, but there are also observational studies. Many of you participated in the natural history study. That was an observational study. There is the FOP registry, which is one of the most important things that an FOP person and their family can do right now to participate in ongoing FOP research is to participate in that registry, and you'll learn more about that at our session later this morning. And then also you'll see the FOP Biobank, and that is also a study that patients can participate in. You donate blood, saliva, urine, and baby teeth are the items that we can accept. So if you go to ifopa.org/biobank, you can learn more about how to participate or stop by their booth in the exhibit hall. Once you've donated to the biobank, what's so important is that you come back and donate again, because again, those checkpoints over time and is how FOP is progressing are so important to the researchers. Both academic researchers and pharmaceutical companies use this data as well. So I encourage you to go to the chat, grab that link, and make sure that you check that out. Again, thank you so much, Kendall, for your time today. It's been really educational for our community, and it's going to be a great resource for us to have others that weren't able to be with us here today. So thank you, everyone. The next session up, you're going to want to make sure you get to, and that session is a session with our Family Services Manager and our Family Services Coordinator on the family services programs that are available to you. And then after that, you'll have a little break in the kids contest, and then you'll be able to watch the session on the FOP registry. And then we'll close out the day with fundraising and awareness activities and closing remarks. So I hope you don't miss that either. So we'll see you in the next session. And again, thank you, Kendall.
Thanks, everyone.